What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Daniel, and today we're going to be talking about my top 10 comedy films of the 2010s. And there's a very specific reason that I want to talk about this. I actually think that the comedy genre is in a really good place right now, and I think the 2010s from 2010 to 2019 was a really good time for them. And I definitely feel like that's not the normal opinion. I hear a lot of people talk about how comedy is dead and they never make good comedies anymore. And, oh, they can't make good comedies because they can't joke because people will find it too offensive or something like that. And I just don't agree with this. I think the genre has had a lot of really, really good movies. Yes, some bad ones, but if you look at any decade, you're going to find a lot of bad comedies. When it comes to the 1980s, we talk about the great movies from that decade. We talk about the titans, the ones that have stood the test of time. We're not talking about the bad, mediocre, lame, boring comedies of the 1980s. We've forgotten about them. So we think of that as a great time for the genre because we're looking at those great films. I think the same can be said for this decade. I think there's been some absolutely fantastic movies and movies that will stand the test of time. I certainly hope. I'm going to do my part in making that happen by talking about them here today. And we're going to forget about those bad movies and we're going to think of it as a good decade. So let's appreciate these movies here and now while we can. One thing that I want to say is my sort of qualification, my criteria for a movie making it on this list is that the main point of the film has to be being funny. There are certain movies that I eliminated from contention, like Thor Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok is a very funny movie. It's the most pure comedy that Marvel has ever done. But the main point of that movie is to be a kick-ass superhero flick. But also it's got really, really funny moments. Another one was Happy Death Day. That's a great comedy. But the main point of that is to be a slasher horror film. The main point is not to make you laugh, even though it definitely does that. And I'm also not going to be talking about very intellectual indie films that have funny moments, but aren't really comedies through and through, but I put them on to make myself sound smart. That's not what we're doing today. We're talking about pure and simple movies that are funny, and that is their reason for existence. So without further ado, let's jump into it with number 10, Neighbors 2. So Neighbors 1 is another movie that I really like that was eligible for this list, but I end up being a bigger fan of Neighbors 2. Now, Neighbors 1 is about a young married couple who just had a baby, Seth Rogen and Rose Byrne. Rose Byrne, by the way, underrated comedy performer from this decade. They're kind of in that stage of life where they're figuring out how to do adulting, and they're moving out of that 20s, you want to party kind of phase of their lives, but a fraternity moves in next door, led by Zac Efron, and they clash a lot, and there's just a lot of fighting between them and a lot of hilarious antics. And I like that movie. But Neighbors 2 kind of has the benefit that Terminator 2 has. Let me explain. We love Terminator 1 because it's a horror action movie and Arnold is the villain and it's all very cool. But a lot of people like Terminator 2 a bit more because they love to see Arnold as the hero. And that's kind of what we've got going on here with Zac Efron. Zac Efron is such an underrated actor for me. I think he is terrific. He's grown into such an interesting and fun performer since those High School Musical movies. And in this movie, he ends up teaming up with Seth Rogen. And I just love watching them and be friends, love watching them hanging out. I'm going to be judging these movies based on a variety of things. For one thing, how funny is it? Two, filmmaking, like how interesting, how impressive is the filmmaking? But number 3 is heart. And Neighbors 2 just has more heart than Neighbors 1. Also, Neighbors 1, it ends up in a place that is a little bit dark, to be honest. The characters do some questionable things at the end. It leaves some of them in kind of a bad place. Nothing wrong with that, but I do love how Neighbors 2 moves these characters forward. On a filmmaking level, the movie is maybe a little bit less impressive than a lot of other movies we're going to be talking about, and that's why it's at the bottom of the list, but it's a very fun, very funny movie. You got a good supporting performance from Chloe Grace Moretz as well. It's really good stuff. I really like it. At number 8 is Olivia Wilde's Booksmart, which I don't own, which is why we've got a poster right up here. But Booksmart, generally when anybody talks about this movie, they're going to make the comparison to Superbad, maybe even call it a Superbad copy. Now, this may be the hot take of the video, but for me, I actually appreciate this movie a bit more than Superbad. And the reason is I find the characters more likable. Likable characters is very important to me with comedies. I can really appreciate a drama or a thriller about very morally gray, complicated characters, but I don't want to watch a comedy starring Travis Bickle. I personally don't. I want to watch a comedy about people I like, who I want to hang out with, who I want to have some laughs with. And I love the characters in this movie, and I actually find them a bit more relatable for me personally, even though Superbad is about dudes and I'm a guy and Booksmart is about girls. But the girls in this movie, they are basically very uncool because they focus on their schoolwork and extracurriculars. They never got around to partying or anything like that. And I find that more relatable from my high school experience than the total slackers who hang out in the basement and draw penises and everything. Like, that wasn't really me. I was more this kind of nerd than that kind of nerd. I know, you're shocked that I was a nerd in high school. Calm down. On a filmmaking level, this is a great looking movie. It's got beautiful cinematography, actually. It really does. And it's got this really interesting sequence in which the characters get high and in their perception is they turn into Barbies. And it's like this stop motion toy sequence. There's just these interesting visual flares that Olivia Wilde throws into this movie that make it more visually interesting than your average comedy. This movie features that classic teen comedy trope of the kids who want to finally make a move with their crush and get the boy or get the girl in the end. And both of our main characters have that in this movie. And I really appreciate the unexpected directions that both of those plot lines take. So this movie does have some interesting twists to it, and it's just really, really solid stuff. I love this movie. All right, next up is probably the movie with the least heart on the entire list, and that is They Came Together. So They Came Together is the most insane and absurd movie on this list. It is a parody of romantic comedies, and it takes that parody to absolutely insane directions. It's starring Paul Rudd and Amy Poehler as your typical rom-com leads. And I would say of everything on this list, this movie has the best cast. And I don't even want to spoil for you everybody that's in this movie, because watching it is a really fun experience of spotting all of these incredibly famous people all through this film. It's ridiculous. The main point of this movie is that it is a joke machine. It is constantly throwing so many crazy, wild jokes at you a mile a minute. And I feel like no matter who you are, a lot of these jokes are going to land. Maybe not all of them, but there's so many jokes, you're bound to laugh quite a bit. One reason it's a little bit lower on the list is I don't think it works as a romantic comedy on its own. It's just a parody of those. I don't think anybody's really going to care about the romance in this movie or really care about these characters because the comedy is so out there absurd. So this movie is on the list on the strength of being absolutely hilarious, which it totally is. At number 7, we've got a horror comedy called What We Do in the Shadows. So What We Do in the Shadows is the movie, I believe it's the movie where Taika Waititi really pops before he moves on to make the aforementioned Thor Ragnarok. And I think he's making a Star Wars movie right now. And What We Do in the Shadows is a sort of mockumentary, The Office style vampire movie. And yes, I classify this first and foremost as a comedy, not as a horror movie, because I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that the main point of this movie is to be funny, is to tell jokes, is to make you laugh. So that's why it makes it onto the list, other than outside of Happy Death Day, which I think is more of a pure horror movie. Whereas this movie's all about the comedy, man. There is some really good vampire stuff. And one thing that I find so funny about this movie is the vampire characters are actually pretty sweet characters, especially Taika Waititi's character. They're nice to each other and they're just very, very likable. But they're still mass murderers and they just kill people and drink their blood. And there's especially one gory sequence with Taika Waititi where he's killing somebody. And it's just because humans don't matter to these vampires. Killing a human being doesn't make them evil in their minds. It's nothing. It's a human. It doesn't matter. And that's an element of this movie that I find hilarious. So What We Do in the Shadows is definitely one of the 10 funniest movies of the last 10 years. At number 6 is kind of a dark horse, because this is a movie that I thought looked pretty bad from the trailers, but I went to see it anyway, and I absolutely loved it, and it's Blockers. So Blockers is not one on this list that really excels on a filmmaking level. It does have a bit more of that flat TV-like look to it, but this movie I think is on the list on the strength of its heart. What this movie is about is it's got 3 teenage girls, and they're kind of in a typical teen comedy where they make a pact that they're all going to lose their virginity on prom night. It's a very typical plot line for a teen movie, American Pie, whatever else you want to take. But the twist that this movie throws onto it is that it's really from the perspective of the parents. You've got Leslie Mann, who's good in this movie, but is, it's kind of in her typical mode that she's in most Judd Apatow movies and such. But John Cena has secretly become one of my favorite comedic actors working right now, which I can't believe I'm saying that, but on the strength of his performance in this movie, as Peacemaker in the Suicide Squad, he's in a comedy that came out last year straight to Hulu called Vacation Friends, which is also way better than it should be, and John Cena is hilarious in it. And the standout of the movie for me, Ike Barinholtz, who's like the burnout dad who had a messy divorce with the wife, and now he's kind of on the outsides of the suburban clique, and he's trying to work his way back in through this movie. And they're all trying to stop their teenagers from basically having sex. And it's a hilarious movie where they're running all around town trying to accomplish this on their kid's prom night. But it has so much heart to it. It actually has some really good messages in the end about parenting, I think. There's a really sweet moment, actually, between Ike Barinholtz's character and his daughter towards the end that almost kind of makes me choke up a little bit. It's a really strong movie. I love these characters. There's a lot of very funny jokes. And to be honest with you, I rewatch it a lot, more than most movies on this list. At number 6, even more than Blockers, is the movie with the most heart out of all of these movies. And that is The World's End from Edgar Wright. It is the third film in the Cornetto trilogy, the only film in that trilogy eligible for this list based on release date. But of course it is directed by Edgar Wright and starring Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. Those other movies are Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, both awesome. But this is actually my favorite of that trilogy. It's a great movie about a group of middle-aged men who used to be really great friends when they were young. But now, they've moved on in life. They have mortgages, wives, kids, all that kind of stuff. Except Simon Pegg, who is the one of this friend group who will not move on in life and is pushing them to go out with him and do the Golden Mile, I think it's called, where they drink a pint of beer at every bar along this mile stretch. And the genre twist to this movie is an invasion of the body snatchers situation breaks out, and it turns into an alien invasion movie. This movie has great action sequences. It's beautiful from a filmmaking level. It's got some really good alien horror to it, but it never loses sight of the main point, which is to be funny. It's absolutely hilarious, but I cared about these characters so much by the end of the movie. And it just has so much to say about moving on in life, getting old, middle age, especially for men, and like what happens to men when they don't move forward. I really think there's some great messages going on here, but it is also a hilarious and very fun movie. At number 5, because this list will never stop, never stopping, it's Popstar. Never Stop, Never Stopping. Popstar is similar to They Came Together in that it is a spoof. You could say it's a spoof, on sort of like musician documentaries and such, but it's really a spoof of the entire entertainment industry and pop culture in general. At its core, it is the Lonely Island movie. If you don't know The Lonely Island, it's Adam Sandberg's comedy rap group that makes pop rap songs with insane lyrics that are, at least for me when I was in high school and still to this day, are absolutely hilarious. And he plays a pop star in this movie. And the strongest thing about it is the songs. The songs are hysterical in this film. There's especially a song where Andy Samberg sings about Osama bin Laden. One of the funniest things I've ever heard in a movie. Like, I just cry laughing watching that. But unlike They Came Together, I think this movie actually achieves having some good heart to it. There's some great emotional moments actually between the friends. And I think this movie accomplishes having some character arcs, even though the comedy is so silly, so spoofish, so absurd, so ridiculous. It's still, the characters in this movie work. And that's, I think, what's most remarkable about it. But also, it's so funny. Plus, shout out to Tim Meadows. He's incredible in this. At number 3, one of my favorite films from this decade, and absolutely one of the most rewatchable, it is 21 Jump Street. 21 Jump Street is based on a Johnny Depp TV show, old TV show, I think from the 90s, where cops have to go undercover as teenagers into a high school to do a drug bust. These cops are Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum, and the best thing about this movie is that it gave us Channing Tatum. I know this is not his first movie, absolutely realize that, but this is the movie where myself, and I know a lot of other people, this is the movie where we discovered Channing Tatum, and we realized, wow, he's actually a really good actor, and he's hysterically funny. Even though he's in a movie with one of the top comedians of this time, Jonah Hill, he is the standout as such a hysterical character, such a great comedy performance. I'm also a big fan of the sequel, 22 Jump Street, but I'm actually one of those people that prefers the original over that sequel. And the reason being, I love how this movie plays with our expectations in regards to who we think the cool guy is and who we think the nerd is. And everyone going into this process thinks, okay, Channing Tatum's going to play the cool kid. He's going to get in with the popular kids. And Jonah Hill's going to be the nerd. And that's not what happens, because this movie has something interesting to say about the generation gap and how teens have moved forward through different generations. And the teenagers in this movie, they don't think Channing Tatum, who's kind of dumb and is a little bit of a bully at times, they don't think he's cool. They think Jonah Hill is cool because he's smart and because he's funny. And it really shows how things have changed since the 80s, and the cliques have gotten a bit more mixed and less definable. And Channing Tatum ends up getting in with the nerds. And 22 Jump Street reverses that back. But when you reverse that back, it's just to the typical version that we would expect. And that's just a little bit less interesting to me. So this is a great film on pretty much every level. And it also gave us an early, very good performance from Brie Larson, even though the romance there is a little bit weird, but yeah, that didn't cross over into the sequel, but still, she's great in this. At number 2, an absolute box office bomb that is absolutely one of the best movies of the past 10 years. That is Shane Black's The Nice Guys. The Nice Guys is a 1970s set buddy cop movie, even though they're not technically cops. Ryan Gosling is a private detective. Russell Crowe is an enforcer, basically somebody who you pay to go beat somebody up. And it works so well as a mystery noir because they go off on this mystery to find a missing girl in the pornography industry. But it also works as an action movie, as a buddy cop movie. It's got some great action scenes to it. I mean, it's Shane Black. Of course it does. But it is an absolutely hysterical movie. This is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen, and so much of that is due to Ryan Gosling. He gives maybe my favorite comedic performance of the decade, probably this and a performance in the number one we're going to talk about. And, you know, I want him to go back to that so bad because he is good in drama, but a lot of people are good in drama. Maybe a lot of people are better than him at drama even, but there are very few actors working today that are better at comedy than Ryan Gosling, as we can see with this film. There's so much great comedy to this, but a lot of it is dialogue based. I mean, it's Shane Black, so it has great dialogue. So much of my favorite comedy just comes from like a dry line of dialogue, just something very simple, and Ryan Gosling nails all those very well written lines. The Nice Guys is well made on every technical level, but it could not be more hilarious. And where's the sequel? Come on, guys. The Nice Guys 2. There is nothing I want more than that. Let's be honest. But it was a really tough call putting The Nice Guys at number 2. And like, is that going to be my number 1? Or I ended up settling on this movie as number 1. But before I reveal it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. And I would love to know what your favorite comedies of the last decade are. So leave them in the comments below. Would definitely appreciate a subscribe because we've definitely got more videos coming on the way. But for my number 1, let's just hit it. It's Game Night. I ended up going with Game Night because it is the movie that I've watched the most times out of all the movies on this list. It is a movie starring Jason Sudeikis and Rachel McAdams. And they are a married couple who are very competitive, and they're very into playing any kind of games, and they love hosting game nights and having their friends over and just playing a whole bunch of games. But one day, Jason Sudeikis' much more successful older brother, played by Kyle Chandler, volunteers to host the game night, and he goes above and beyond because he's rich, and he says, I have hired this incredible company to come in with their actors, and we're going to play a murder mystery game. So everybody's excited, but it turns out Kyle Chandler is involved in some criminal organizations, and this murder mystery game turns out to be real. So it becomes this one crazy night comedy where they're running all around town. Part of the time they don't even know that it's not a game, and eventually they figure it out and they have to try to save Kyle Chandler. It's an incredibly funny movie, much because of the performances. Everyone in this movie is giving a top-notch performance. I don't care what genre we're talking about, but my favorite is Rachel McAdams, who's the other person I said is her and Ryan Gosling, my two favorite comedy performances of this decade. Rachel McAdams is so funny in this movie because she is so gung-ho for everything in this, and she is so excited. And for a while, she thinks that it's a game, so she's being way too confident and crazy with the criminals who she thinks are actors. But even when they find out what's going on, she still doesn't lose that edge to her. She's so funny, and she's another actor I want to do more comedy so bad. But also, Jesse Plemons. Most of the time when people talk about this movie, Jesse Plemons is the first thing they mention, and it's for good reason. He is their weird cop neighbor who wants to take part in their game nights, but they don't let him. It's an airtight script, honestly. It's got some great character arcs to it. It's got great action sequences. There is a one-take chase sequence through a mansion that's like expertly filmed. It is such a good movie on a technical level. They also made this really interesting stylistic choice to make all of the wide city shots miniatures. So anytime you like zoom out to the town, you see the street, you see a house. It's very clearly they're using miniatures, and I love that. It's an interesting stylistic choice. It's also got a great score that's very 80s synthy, kind of John Carpenter themed, and you're generally not going to hear a score like that in a comedy nowadays. So there's so many things about this movie that make it so remarkable, but it's the most rewatchable movie on this list. It's the movie that makes me the most happy. So that's it, folks. That's my top 10 comedies of the 2010s, 2010 to 2019. But I would love to know, once again, what are your favorites? Do you agree with me? Do you love this decade for comedy? Do you agree with kind of the general consensus that it's been a bad decade and hopefully things get better in the future? Whatever it is, I want to know. Leave your comments down below. Like and subscribe. I would certainly appreciate that. And, let me know if you want more top 10 comedy videos of each decade going back. I think the 2000s might be a little bit of a struggle for me, but I'm sure there's 10 great ones in there. So let me know if you want to talk about that. I'll see you next time.